Engineers shall issue public statements only in an objective and truthful manner. You, of course, live by personal ethical standards, including that you should tell the truth. Our friends, families, and anyone we meet should be able to trust that we're not deceiving them. This principle applies to engineering practice, but there is additional depth to it. We are required to be not just truthful, but objective. That means that we have to be very careful about basing our public statements on observed facts, not unfounded opinions. You will be surprised at how much credibility folks will automatically give you when you are an engineer. They do so because they know that we don't go around spouting off thoughts that aren't based in reality. You also have to be careful to document and qualify your statements so that readers and listeners understand their factual basis. For example, you may be advising a client on the appropriate material to select for an application. It is not enough to say material X is the cheapest. Prices for materials change quite a lot over time due to many factors, and prices vary by the quantity you buy from a vendor. You are doing the best possible job for your client by saying, as of today's date, material X is the cheapest when buying 3 tons per year. However, the price does vary with petroleum prices, and a table comparing X versus other materials is attached. And yes, answering questions like this means that at parties, non-engineers learn not to ask us lots of questions. But in our professional life, this is important. Another aspect of being objective is that we avoid bias and acknowledge it when it is unavoidable. If you are advising a client on material selection, you cannot be the owner of a company supplying one of the candidate materials and not be biased. You will often hear the phrase conflict of interest to describe these types of situations. If you have one interest to provide good service and advice to your client, it should not conflict with a separate interest to make money with your material supply business. So what if a conflict of interest is unavoidable? Maybe there are only 2 possible materials for this application and your company is the only one that supplies one of them. In that case, you have to inform everyone involved of your interests so that they understand the potential biases and can evaluate the 2 options for themselves. Engineers shall perform services only in the areas of their competence. Here at the beginning of your engineering education, this might seem like a strange concern. Isn't it obvious that persons with chemical engineering degrees work as chemical engineers, and likewise for all the other fields? In engineering practice, however, you'll quickly see that the lines are actually pretty blurry and sometimes non-existent. Designing a particular system may incorporate elements of many engineering fields, and after several years of working, you may find yourself doing things pretty far outside what you studied in school. Is that a problem? Well, no. All engineers are expected to learn and grow throughout their entire careers. That's lifelong learning. So professional ethical standards for this principle recognize the role of both education and experience in building competency. So what's the problem? There will be many opportunities for you to get work or even do voluntary work without pay in areas where you have not developed competence. Maybe you studied aerospace engineering in school and then worked for many years in that industry in manufacturing, learning elements of industrial, mechanical, and computer engineering along the way. But then someone approaches you and asks if you will review the plans for a steel frame building, something about which you know close to nothing. If you accept this job, you will not be qualified to make sure that the structural design is safe. Or maybe there's an outside chance you could study structural design and develop competency, but that will take so long, probably at least a year, that your client will not be well served. You should also remember that competence is not just about basic disciplines of engineering. It applies sometimes to focused areas within a field. If you've spent your whole career as an electrical engineer focused on design of microelectronics, you could very well not have the necessary competence to work on a high voltage power transmission project, even if it is still considered electrical engineering. Those of you who eventually become licensed professional engineers may see especially pronounced cases of this. There are many types of projects that require the approval of a licensed PE, but engineering licenses in most states do not have practice areas designated on them. You are just a PE, not a civil PE or mechanical PE. There are unscrupulous clients who will offer you work to simply stamp your approval on a project outside of your area of competency because it is cheaper and faster for them. This is definitely unethical and will lead to a disciplinary hearing before the state board and penalties up to loss of your license. Engineers shall act for each employer or client as faithful agents or trustees. It would be a pretty shocking football game if a quarterback took the snap and then ran the ball backwards into his own end zone to score for the opposing team. That would be the end of that quarterback's career. This ethical principle means that others with whom you have engaged in a professional relationship can trust that you are truly playing for their team. It applies to two specific kinds of relationships: employer-employee and client-engineer. In the case of the employer-employee relationship, you are obligated to be a hard worker who does not undercut your employer or create conflicts of interest. If your employer has proprietary information or methods, you should not be disclosing those outside of your organization without approval. You should not start an outside business that competes with your employer while still on the job. You should not act in ways that damage the reputation of your employer. When changing jobs, you have to be especially careful that you do not leave your old employer in the lurch to complete ongoing projects. And you also should not misrepresent your abilities to your new employer if they were dependent on being at your old job. Changing jobs can actually lead to some tough ethical issues, but it is something that most of you will do multiple times in your career. In the case of client-engineer relationships, you should work to serve your client's interests, again, without conflict. Do the work that your client has asked you to do. Don't design something that they don't need, even if it would be really cool. Don't divulge confidential information to others. Be careful when working for competitors simultaneously. It is not impossible, but you have to make sure that each client's interests are protected. If you're working for a public client, like a government agency, remember that your client is larger than just the handful of people with whom you are meeting. The client is the public. Respect the terms of contracts and don't lobby your client for extra time or money unless it is really necessary. It should be said that being a faithful agent for your employer or client never invalidates other ethical obligations. If your employer is cutting corners on engineering work and endangering public safety, you should not ignore that on the basis of being a faithful employee. If your client asks you to make a false statement to advance their interests, you have to refuse, because your obligation to be truthful is more important than being faithful to your client. An area that can be a bit of a blind spot on this principle for some young engineers is the use of social media and other forms of casual statements. Remember that you are considered a representative of your employer and the engineering profession even outside of the office and working hours and on your personal social media accounts. Tweeting out complaints about a boss with an anonymous handle might seem safe, but it's damaging to your employer's reputation and often shockingly easy to figure out that it's you doing it. If you're going out to happy hour with some coworkers at the end of the week, don't mouth off about your clients in public earshot. You never know who could overhear. Finally, many of you will be working in areas where some technologies are covered by export control restrictions. The U.S. federal government does not allow transfer to other countries. Doing so can lead to big problems not just for the individual doing it, but also for her or his employer. You'll get more specialized training on things like this later, but be aware that some crimes result in this kind of collective punishment. Be sure that you consider your actions in light of the effects they have on those around you.